Welcome, viewers. This is the Torah Insights podcast, episode number one. And today we'll have on Carl Knack. But first, I'll give a quick introduction. I decided to start this channel because I would like to put forth biblical scholarship in groups of Hebrew roots, Messianic Judaism, Churches of God, different Torah observant circles. I think there's a lack of scholarship, not just everywhere, but in our groups. So I've decided to start putting forth different scholars, educators, teachers. Uh, uh, Tonight we're having on, as I said, Carl Knack, who is an undergraduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, majoring in anthropology, classical humanities, and religious studies. He is a member of UCG and attends frequently. Does that sound about right, Carl?
Yep, very succinct and accurate.
That's good to hear. That's what we want to hear, right?
Hmm.
The topic tonight is anthropology. We will kind of go into what that is in a second, and we'll go through different aspects of it. This is going to be a two-part podcast. First one is more of an introduction to anthropology and kind of how it works. And the second one's going to be going in more toward the priestly writings of the Bible, the Tanakh, and we'll be discussing that through an anthropological lens. But Carl, do you want to add anything to that?
No, just I am very excited and passionate about this topic. I'm studying anthropology here at the undergrad level, but I'm also studying Hebrew Bible. Um, I love both fields very deeply. I love the Bible because of my religious tradition as well, my religious background, but I also love it and value it as a witness to the human experience, as a witness to real lived history, real lived human experiences. And that side of the biblical narrative is greatly benefited by anthropology. So um, every chance that I get, I love to share this passion about these two, for
Right.
me at least, deeply intertwined fields.
Right. Yeah, and I didn't realize how important the field was in the context of the Bible until, Rico Cortez recommended me some sources. You recommend me some sources. I dug into them,
Mm.
and the Bible is greatly affected by um, non-Western cultures, right? The cultures that
Mhm.
the Bible was written in, and we don't quite understand that in the Western world. So hopefully we can shed light on that tonight. All right.
Yep.
So the first question tonight that's going to start the get the ball rolling is how do the methods, or sorry, what is anthropology? Let's define the term that we're discussing tonight. What is anthropology, Carl?
Of course. So literally, it is the study of humanity, anthro, uh, anthropology, the study of humanity. In the United States, it has taken on a very specific meaning in academia, in university settings. It refers to the intersection of four separate subfields: biological anthropology, which is like human uh, physiology, how that relates, archaeology, which is the material record of the deep past, cultural anthropology, which is usually lived experiences. So, cultural anthropologists, for their field work, they don't do like an archaeologist does or a biological anthropologist and go and like excavate at a site
Right.
trying to find human remains or material culture or stuff like that. A cultural anthropologist goes somewhere and talks to people about their culture, about their society. Um, Cultural anthropology is fascinating as well. In Europe, anthropology means cultural anthropology. So a lot of anthropologists use the methodologies of cultural anthropology, the methodologies learned from living people, lived experiences, and apply that to the distant past. And there's a fourth branch as well, and that is linguistic
Mhm,
anthropology.
mhm,
Linguistics is kind of independent of the rest of anthropology.
mhm.
The other three are, in the United States at least, are the main focus, but linguistics is often included as
Yeah.
well.
And
And
linguistics is still important for biblical
it's,
studies, right?
oh, definitely linguistics, philology, which is the history of the development of language, the evolution of a language, is
Right.
eminently important.
And we
Um,
see the evolution of, say, Hebrew in the
mhm,
biblical text. Um,
yeah,
from the Torah, from Genesis, we see different words being used throughout the
mhm,
Tanakh to the end of it, and
yep,
in the Second Temple period. So,
certainly, yeah.
and
Yeah,
would you
there's,
want to touch real quick on the cognate languages of Hebrew, maybe,
oh, of
and
course.
linguistic sect?
Yeah, so um, Hebrew itself is a Semitic language. That's the language family.
Hmm.
My professor likes to explain it as sort of a family tree, so I think that would work well. Sort of the great grandpappy of all of the Semitic languages is like Proto-Afro-Asiatic. So that's the father of Egyptian and all the Semitic languages, like Egyptian and like Amazigh, Berber languages on one side, and then Semitic on the other. And then from there we have Semitic, which broke off into a few different branches. There's West Semitic, there's East Semitic, and there's South Semitic. East Semitic is Akkadian, stuff like that. South Semitic doesn't really come up that much. It's a few like South Arabic dialects. And then West Semitic is most of the languages of the biblical world are West Semitic. So, and from West Semitic, there were a few successive phases. There was West Semitic, and then there's Central Semitic,
Okay.
and then Arabic is a descendant of that.
Okay.
And some of the exact placements are debated, but this is generally sort of the gist of it. And then from Central Semitic, we also have Proto-Northwest Semitic. And from Proto-Northwest Semitic is where we have Aramaic is a descendant of that. We have the Canaanite dialect continuum. A dialect continuum is many different languages that are all mutually intelligible with each other. So, and out of that, we have uh, Moabite, Edomite, Ammonite, Hebrew, the different stages of Hebrew. There's, early biblical Hebrew, classical biblical Hebrew, late Persian biblical Hebrew. They're all related there.
Right.
So that's kind of just the family tree. And all of these languages were in both physical proximity to each other, but they were also all related, with the exception of Hittite. Really, that's the big one. Hittite and Greek, they're not related to the rest. But
Okay.
otherwise, all of them are at least somewhere along. So Arabic is related to Hebrew. Aramaic
Mhm.
is pretty close to Hebrew. Moabite and those other dialects are really close. Like they're just a couple grammar rules different from Hebrew. So kind of like the Book of Ruth is kind of like this. Um, the authors of Ruth understood that a Hebrew person could go to Moab and just like talk, and vice versa. A Moabite could come
Right.
to Judah and they could understand each other because the languages are so close. They're different. They have slight differences, but kind of like our languages, English, German,
Right.
Dutch, they're all related.
And that's mentioned in the biblical text too, right? Where there's um, I forget how the story goes exactly, but someone doesn't speak
Yes.
Hebrew with the exact accent
Yep.
as the opposing party, and
Yeah,
there's a
the
interaction
shibboleth.
there.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
shibboleth test from the Book of Judges,
Hmm.
where one tribe speaks a slightly different dialect than the other tribe. And that is made a big point of in the text.
Right.
All these languages, they're not only related to each other, but they're living side by side.
Yeah.
So they're engaging with each other very deeply.
Right. Which is
And
the anthropological
mhm,
essence of the linguistics strand, right? Is that we see different cultures with different languages interacting.
yeah, yeah, the interactions of different languages. Linguistic anthropology also, I don't do linguistic anthropology per se, but I do other linguistics. But
Right.
it also looks at the structures in the mouth and how that affects speech, which that's
Yeah.
a whole other
That
fascinating thing
is,
where tongue placement.
yeah,
Um,
that's deep.
yeah.
Um, I'm sure we could stay on this strand for a long time, so let's kind of circle back before we move on to our next question. You mentioned culture. I was of the assumption that most of anthropology was dealing with culture.
Hmm.
Um, and I know you described cultural anthropology a little bit differently, like that's today in the present, going to different places, interacting with these people. But
Hmm.
with the historical lens, is that more, is anthropology in the historical view just cultural studies, or is there differences there?
Yeah, so there are some differences in methodology between, cultural anthropologists and archaeologists and biological anthropologists. They all look at different time frames, different timetables, um, but the undergirding principles are the same. Um, and there's a phrase that I like in anthropology, and it's circulated around a lot. I've heard in multiple classes. Anthropology seeks to make the familiar strange and the strange familiar. So, what that basically means is that anthropologists practice by close looking. It's
Yeah.
about close looking, is really what so much modern anthropology is based on. And that means both close looking of other cultures that are different from our own, that don't really make sense to us. Cultural logics are a thing. Like there's some stuff that just makes sense because we're, Americans or whatever it is.
Mhm.
Some stuff is just intuitive. All
Yeah.
cultures have those intuitive things.
Right.
And anthropology tries to unpack that, tries to make those unfamiliar things in another culture familiar. But it also is useful because the same methods, the same close looking, makes us look at our own culture and go, huh, why do we do that?
Yeah.
These just intuitive things we do,
Yeah.
these things we just assume. Why do we assume that? Why do we view the world like that?
Right. And so in the Bible, they had different different assumptions, different functions, just things that were cultural norms. And what we need to do with the Bible, right, is take this strange text that's foreign to us in our Western world and approach it through an anthropological lens and make that strange foreign flavor of the Bible not so strange. Let's get
Yeah.
into the culture. Let's study it out. That makes perfect sense to me. Some people it wouldn't make so much sense to with,
Yeah.
King James
Yeah.
onlyists and super um, westernized people. But I mean, through a logical lens, that's what you want to do.
Yes.
The Bible, to quote John Walton, and Rico quotes him all the time, he says that the Bible was written for us, but it was not written to us. And I'm
Hmm.
sure you can attest to that. Like, that is
Hmm.
the most true statement when it comes to the Bible, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that is so important. And that's as I said, another thing anthropology does very well is it shows, these things we just assume about like the nature of the Bible as an English language book. Maybe those assumptions don't actually pan out. Maybe
Right.
those assumptions about the nature of how books are written, how manuscripts are transmitted, how people teach, the way sermons are given, the way history is told, that maybe these things we assume from a Western American perspective, maybe those things aren't universal. which in fact
Right.
they're not.
And they're
Maybe
not. Yeah.
those, yeah, the biblical authors viewed all those things, how books are written, how history is told. They viewed that differently than we view those things, and that's a disconnect sometimes because we try to shoehorn, we try to squeeze our assumptions into the Bible,
Right.
which is
And so
damaging.
that's, I mean, it's really something that I've experienced studying Leviticus and the priestly texts.
Mhm.
When I started to read Roy Gain, when I started to read Frank Gorman, Jacob Milgram, it's like, no wonder us Westerners start to read the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, we get to Leviticus, and we're like, this is the most boring thing I've ever read. It makes no sense. But when you approach it with an anthropological lens, it's like, wow, this makes more sense than anything. Like, this was their life. This made sense to them. This was functioning. This was true function. And the whole Bible functions in the ancient world. And to get to that, what would the word be? Ideology, you have to go through anthropology and culture, right?
Mhm.
So I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that. If not, we can move on to the next question.
I think we can, that's a good segue to.
All right. All right. And the next part of this podcast, the second part will be on the priestly text, which will be very interesting. Something I've more been accustomed with than the whole anthropology as a whole, basically, right?
Yeah.
So, next question on the list is how do the methods work?
Mm.
We've touched on that a little bit already, so
Sure. Yeah. Um, the more recent methods, a lot of it are based off of a work by a scholar by the name of Geertz. He was a prominent anthropologist who challenged a lot of the norms before him, and he encouraged what he terms close looking. And he gets that from another anthropologist, um, Gilbert Ryle. Well, he doesn't call it close looking, it is close looking. So Geertz derives a concept from another anthropologist, Gilbert Ryle, and that is thick description. Thick description. And that is the basis of so much of anthropological method. And what it means is that before you start applying theories and before you start applying critical lenses and these other things, really intensely look at the culture you are studying.
right.
Describe all of the details. Like in cultural anthropology, I've done a couple projects here at the University of Wisconsin with that in my coursework. And if you do something with cultural anthropology, at your next possible moment, as soon as you've had your field experience, you sit down somewhere and you just write notes about everything you can remember, and you try and describe it in the utmost detail, even things that you don't think are important, because sometimes those things you don't think are really important are actually pivotal. Those little, those moments are glimpses sometimes at cultural distinctions, at differences, at things that are fundamentally important. Um, I did a project on religious music in a Sabbatarian environment,
Hmm.
and how that makes meaning, looking at different anthropologists. And I had to try and the smallest details were the things that I relied on in my paper. The general gist is kind of what people see, but anthropologists look for those details. And then once we have compiled that thick description, once we have looked closely and intensively at the text, or at whatever it is, the culture, the experience, for anthropology of the Bible, we look at the text in the same way. We approach the text trying to go, okay, what are all the details? What are the assumptions the text is making? What are the references? What are the parallel passages? What are the genres? What are the linguistic background? What is the
Right.
cultural background? And we do all of that. We compile all that information. And then we apply methodologies. And
Right.
then the next step from thick description is cross-cultural comparison, where we put different cultures in dialogue with one another. Say we're studying oral traditions,
Yeah.
the idea of orality in the biblical text. Look at oral traditions from other cultures. How do oral
Yeah.
traditions function in Greece? How do they function in Arabia? Further off, how do they function in China,
Yeah.
in Japan?
Native Americans have a lot of
Yeah.
oral tradition.
Native American, yeah. There is an interesting paper. I haven't read through it yet, but I kind of flagged it a few years ago as something interesting, looking at how Mayan communities are orally transmitting biblical texts that they receive from missionaries. Um,
Really?
yeah,
Around what year?
contemporary, I believe. So contemporary communities are that are primarily oral are transmitting the same biblical stories in an oral mode. It's
Wow.
kind of reverting to that in
So
some cultures.
contemporary is usually dates between.
I believe that was current.
Okay.
So, yeah, but contemporary, is within current generation
Okay, I see.
usually. So, um, yeah, and and then you do the cross-cultural comparison, and then you apply critical lenses. So there's different critical lenses, but they focus on different things. Biblical studies as well has a whole set of critical
Right.
lenses, but
I
they're
think
different.
that
Yeah.
that first thing or that first part that you were mentioning there, like narrative and story, what kind of text you're reading is very, very
Mhm.
neglected. Like they throw that out. The Bible says what it says. I don't need narrative. I can read it in English and understand it perfectly. Um, I think
Yeah.
that is something that is really neglected and not recognizing why the letter or book was written as well.
Yeah.
That's definitely something to look into.
Certainly. Yeah, kind of touching on our the previous phase of the conversation, another fundamental assumption of anthropology over the past several decades is called reflexivity. Reflexivity. And that is the idea that it's not that you eliminate your biases. There's a helicopter going overhead. So reflexivity is the idea that you don't eliminate your biases because you can't, but you acknowledge them and you document them.
Mhm.
So you point out, this is my background. This is my, it can take whatever form. This is my culture. This is my religious background, etc. And you acknowledge that. I think that much of just the Christian world and like the world at large, frankly, would benefit from more reflexivity, from looking at ourselves and going, maybe I think I process information this way, not because it is the best or the universal way to do it, but because I have a cultural context. We all have a cultural context.
Right.
And when we approach that, it makes just like our relations with fellow human beings better.
Yeah.
Because instead of being so dogmatic, this is the way it has to be. Well, does it have to be that way?
Yeah.
Um, and the same with the biblical text. If we're reflexive, and it doesn't mean we're wrong. Reflexivity is not saying that our assumptions are wrong. It's just recognizing we have assumptions.
Hmm.
And that when we go to, say, the biblical text and we're reflexive about it, we acknowledge this is my theological system. I have to acknowledge in my scholarship, I'm a Sabbatarian Christian.
Yeah.
I'm a pronomian Christian. I think it's correct. I think it is an effective theological system. I believe it is true. However, I need to acknowledge that. And when working with other cultures or ancient texts, admit that, sometimes my assumptions aren't necessarily the
Right.
assumptions of the text.
Now, would you say that's a pretty big reasoning for why we have so many denominations in the Christian church is that we're not setting aside our bias
Yeah.
and we're not looking at the text to whom it was written.
Yeah,
Instead, we don't put aside that lens of what we think is right to look at what the Hebrews thought was right, or the
yeah,
Israelites, the way that they viewed the world.
yeah,
And because I could see how that is a large proponent to why we have so many different
yeah.
denominations of Christianity. And I mean, another one is, neglecting the biblical languages, but we're
Hmm.
focusing on anthropology. And I think putting ourselves in the shoes of the Israelites, of the Hebrews, the first century Jew, would definitely help us to understand the biblical message
Yeah,
rather than staying
certainly.
in our American shoes, right?
Yeah, yeah. And that's um John Calvin made sense for his time period. Like what he was saying, his assumptions about an inherently violent world and his assumptions made sense for the period he
Right,
was living in. The same goes for Martin Luther. The same goes for um, Augustine. The same goes for the Nicene Creed. Like all of these prominent documents from Christian history, these prominent theologians and scholars from Christian history
right,
were writing in ways that were very logical for their time period, but they often were not addressing the assumptions they were bringing to the text. Martin Luther had a lot of assumptions about what
right.
Jews are, what the law is.
Based on his upbringing, based on his
Yeah,
culture, right?
yeah, yeah, and that had a bearing on how he viewed the text. Not all major figures in historic Christianity were quite that same way. There were others who, there have always been people who strove to look at cultural context,
Right.
who
I mean, that
strove.
exact same thing happens today
Yeah,
to John
exactly.
Calvin, you
Yep.
know. The
Yeah.
like the exact same thing. People are, maybe raised in, you
Hmm.
know, and they're brought up to hate Jews or something else, and they're like, oh, even though Christ was a Jew, they murdered him. We should hate him now. There's the
Yep.
synagogue of Satan, right?
Yep. Yeah. And there's a lot of people who still deny the Jewishness of Jesus.
Right. I know.
Um, it's just that's just a fact. Jesus was a Jew. Now, I would say Jesus was more than a physical flesh and blood Jew because
Yeah.
he's also the creator of the universe come in the flesh, but his human nature was Jewish. He was a
Yeah.
Jew. Yeah, and looking at the ancient cultures, looking at the Hebraic cultures of the Bible, looking at other contemporary cultures, Egyptian culture, Akkadian culture. Um, there was just a kind of a tangential note, but two, I believe they're both Akkadian tablets, very small Akkadian tablets were found in the vicinity of Jerusalem.
Right. Just recently, I had seen
Just
that. Yeah.
recently. And there's a lot of debates about that. Right there, uh, Akkadian culture has a bearing on how we view the biblical text because the biblical authors engaged with Akkadian stuff.
I know.
They,
Yeah.
some of them may have even, and it's speculative, but based on these tablets, yeah, someone in Jerusalem knows Akkadian. Some of them may have engaged in those texts directly,
Which
but
is crazy, right?
yeah,
We have multilingual people in
mhm,
ancient Jerusalem.
yeah. Yep. That's another thing about in America, we're usually monolingual.
Yeah,
And
exactly. Not a
and
thing in the ancient world.
yeah,
I mean,
and there's differing levels of fluency, but
right.
they could
I mean,
know.
it's not a thing, but
Yeah.
they knew way more languages than we do on
Yeah.
on average.
Yeah. The average Jew from Galilee in the first century probably knew Aramaic as their first
Right.
tongue.
Right.
They were raised learning Hebrew and using Hebrew, so they'd be fully conversant in that. And most of them probably were at least partially, if not fully fluent in Greek. Um,
Yeah.
and then you add um,
Latin.
how many of them know Latin. which
Yeah.
that would have been another
Paul would have
administrative language.
Paul was a Roman citizen. He would have known
Yeah,
Latin and Greek and
it would have been likely, yeah.
Aramaic.
Yeah, yeah, and Paul spent some time in probably the Nabatean kingdom
Right.
down in Arabia. So if if he knew
Yeah.
all of those languages of the places where he ministered, he would have known at least five.
Right.
Um,
I would say a minimum of 4 or 5. Like
yeah.
Paul knew.
Hmm.
The average Christian wouldn't recognize that, which is an
Yes.
important thing. We need to be placing ourselves in
Yeah.
the shoes of those people, like
Yeah.
Paul, right?
Yep. Yeah. In
Otherwise,
a
you wouldn't know
world.
that he
Yeah.
knew over 4 languages, which is really foreign to us. Like, wow,
Yeah.
it's impressive. He was a scholar,
Yeah. Yep. Certainly. Yeah. And there were a lot of people who wouldn't have known that many, but even
right?
for the sort of uneducated, they would have been exposed to between three and five or six different languages throughout their lifetimes.
Hmm.
Um, that would have just been their reality.
Right.
And they may have had differing levels of fluency, but that's how they thought. And we need to be reflexive about that in America of, oh, this idea of this massive nation, everyone, almost everyone being able to communicate in the same language. They didn't have that back then.
Right.
They had like basically everyone in the Roman East knew Aramaic and Greek. Like in like the Near East, they all knew Aramaic. They also knew Greek because of Alexander's Macedonian Empire. Um, but Latin was also present. Akkadian, like that
Yeah.
was lingua franca for a long time. There were still pockets of Akkadian, probably up until the first century. I'm not saying any of the New Testament authors engaged in that, but like there was still like those languages were present.
Right. I mean, obviously they didn't engage in too much of that material, any ancient Near Eastern material, but man, Paul, Paul was such a scholar, it makes you think like, man, this guy he seems like he's familiar with a lot of the ancient thought, right? Even up in the first century. But anyway, I think it's a good segue into the next kind of subject, right? We've talked about how language has changed over time, um, you know, between the Tanakh period and the first century, how the culture has changed. So the next kind of subject is how has the field of anthropology changed over time? And I think you definitely have some notes on that, right?
Oh yeah, certainly. So anthropology has some very troubling origins as a field that the field at large has done a very good job overall in addressing. Some of the earliest anthropologists from like the 19th century, Morgan, Tyler, uh, guys like that, they were mostly armchair scholars. Like they would visit other cultures on occasion, but they were mostly just, armchair scholar means like you don't actually study this stuff in person, you just kind of theorize about it. They theorized about cultures in very universalized ways. And part of that is so they were responding to an even older theory that there were multiple human species instead of us all being Homo sapiens, that there were the different ethnicities were actually different races that
Right.
were created by God at different periods, even.
I looked that up when I was reading some stuff on anthropology before the podcast,
Yeah.
and it mentioned like a strand of anthropology that was just focused on kind of the evolutionary subject.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
it seems to be a pretty big part.
Yeah. That's more, biological anthropology
Yeah,
addresses a lot of evolution, but um, kind of the entirety of the field since like the mid 1800s has recognized, there's one human species
right.
in the modern day. Neanderthals we can debate, but like modern humans, we are Homo sapiens. Um, you know, how sapient we are sometimes, how wise we are, that we can. We can debate that too, but we're all, that's
Some
the
of us more
main.
than others.
Well, yeah, we grow in wisdom, but yeah, so that's
Correct.
our, we were all one species. And then after that, kind of, Tyler and Morgan and a few others come in and they really look at society as a universal, unilinear, like one direction evolution. So they started in this really primitive stage. Humans are really primitive. And then they got a little more advanced, a little more advanced. Um, there's clan stage, tribal stage, kingdoms, and eventually, sort of the climax is
Right.
contemporary Victorian England. That's like the ideal, like the peak of social evolution. Um, I think there were a lot of people in Victorian England who would have disagreed with that, but that's the way they wrote, that like all of human history is pointing to this industrial revolution ideal of society. Karl Marx kind of engaged with that same idea of like human beings started
Yeah.
like really sort
Don't
of
confuse
primitive.
Karl Marx and Karl Nack. I know they both got
Yes,
the beard
no.
going, but
We are different Karls, but Marx viewed history very similar. It's this sort of direct progression towards his view is the like communist utopia. Uh, but it's the same thing. There's a unilinear, there's a one-track development. Everything is going down that road. There's a whole like intellectual thought behind that as well. But then in the 20th century, anthropologists first, they were really challenging those earlier generations of scholars, how they were removed from the cultures they were studying. Malinowski did that. He was another very problematic figure. He was more like World War II period. He lived and worked for years amongst native Pacific Islanders who he was studying, the Trobriand Islands. He lived with them, with, studied them. He still had a lot of problematic theories, but he kind of moved in that direction. And then later in the 20th century, the field moved away from that unilinear model to one in which that recognizes it's not a one-track road, and plus a hunter-gatherer society is not inferior inherently to an industrialized one. They're just different.
right.
They're just different expressions of the human condition, different expressions of society. Um, and that the definitions between these different phases are porous, and that they go in different orders. That some cultures, frankly, um, there's an interesting example from Japan, the Jomon. They were an early culture from Japan. They were aware of archaeology they were aware of agriculture. They didn't do
Right.
archaeology. They were aware of agriculture for a long time. They practiced arboriculture, tree cultivation, but they didn't practice agriculture for at least centuries.
Do you think we go off on a tangent on that real quick? So, anthropology in different cultures does affect their, this is going back to an earlier point, but what you said made me think of it. Anthropology does affect, their view on the world and their view on things.
Yeah,
It affects their view on morality, right?
yeah.
And we in the Western world have a view on morality based on our upbringing, right?
Mhm.
And, a lot of that is fortunately for us based on the Bible. Now, morality is going to be different in different cultures, right? And that kind of debunks the atheist um the I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank. The atheist argument for morality having a basis without, a written text or something to base it off of because morality is simply different in different cultures. And, we
Yeah.
can study that through anthropology, but it points out why it's so important for us to have a
Hmm.
written text to tell us what is moral and to tell us what is not moral, because morality is different in different cultures. And, maybe it reflects in the Bible when you study it through anthropology, the Hebrew,
Hmm.
what the Hebrews would better understand as a system of morality, but ultimately it is God's um, own ways.
Yeah, from an anthropological perspective, different cultures construct different sort of moral schemas. I tend to think that, like, philosophically, ultimately, um, God is a moral God, and that is
Exactly.
sort of the source of morality,
Right.
from a religious standpoint. But anthropology recognizes the differences there. Um, yeah, and yeah, some atheists kind of point that out, moral relativism. Um, moral, anthropology is not trying to seek like the origins of morality as much as it's
Right.
trying to
I'm
inquire about
saying,
their nature.
through anthropology, we can identify that there's lots of differences of morality in different cultures,
Yes,
right?
exactly. I mean,
It's
even
not
just,
something that's rock
yeah,
solid unless you do have a rock solid thing like the Bible to go
yeah,
off of.
even just uh, American individualism. That's a thing we kind of assume that all cultures are kind of individualistic like we are, but many cultures around the world now and throughout history were more concerned with the collective, uh, about collective good, collective needs,
Yeah.
and they were less individualistic.
And
That's even
some it's
just,
even the opposite. Like it's more individual,
yeah,
right? It's very, different. It's very
yeah,
different. It's strange to us, like you mentioned in the beginning. And that's what
mhm,
anthropology seeks to do is make it not strange, the study of it anyway.
yeah,
Uh,
yep,
so foreign. Some things are just so foreign to us.
hmm,
We're confined in our Western mind and our upbringing, right?
yeah,
It's
yeah,
like, no wonder we read the Bible and we're just like, man,
hmm,
what is this talking about?
yeah,
Same thing with every religion, right?
yep,
Like, this makes no sense.
hmm, yeah, and that religious anthropology of religion does a very good job looking at different religious structures or even philosophical systems that do not address the divine and put them in dialogue with each other. And I even find that, as like talking about cross-cultural comparison, looking at other religious systems helps raise questions about my own and helps me think about my own in different ways. I'm not talking about syncretism where we like import ideas from other cultures and just kind of plaster them onto our own, but meaningful cultural dialogue helps us see things, notice things that otherwise we wouldn't. We would just gloss over. That's one of the best ways to be reflexive is to look at another culture and go, huh, that's how they think about stuff? Huh, maybe I should reevaluate how I think a little bit. Maybe,
Yeah.
the biblical
Maybe
authors
I'm
did
not
not.
th exactly.
Mhm.
Maybe I'm not thinking about this biblical passage correctly.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, they wouldn't be thinking how I'm thinking
Yep.
about it.
Yeah. And that's why the field of biblical studies, critical biblical studies, has always been open to people of all religions. Well,
Right.
I shouldn't say always, because in the 19th century there was a lot of exclusion against Jews, but
Yeah.
like the goal has been to be inclusive of Jews, Christians, Muslims, atheists, agnostics. Everyone has biases they bring to the text, but if you're a good scholar,
All
you love
right.
the Bible, hey, you're welcome.
You know, that is they do put out good scholarship, some of the more,
Mhm.
secular or other people of different religions, but we we should test everything to the Bible, to the actual facts, to the source documents, right? Because there's always going to be um, people of other religions trying to sneak
Mhm.
things in, or maybe someone with a more liberal approach to the Bible, which isn't always bad, but we still should test those things, right?
Yeah, that's from a theological standpoint, yeah, and um I don't dismiss what someone has to say just because we disagree on
Oh,
theology, but
absolutely.
I do notice that, sometimes we disagree on our assumptions about the nature of the text, about the nature of its history, based on our different theological assumptions. And that's just something that I kind of, you know, keep in my back pocket, so to
Yeah.
speak.
So
Um,
I have another side question then. Um, if you're having a conversation with someone and they don't quite understand the anthropological view of something, what's the best way to communicate that to them? Because we can be so set in our view of something, like that's just how it is. Like we don't think twice about it. What would be the best way to, lovingly, but share the anthropological view of something, how they would have thought of it? Um,
yeah, so I get this from a friend who got it from some scholars, I believe, but um, what is a very good effective method is show the rewards of it. So instead of like using it to take something away from someone, say they're a King James onlyist and they're really dedicated to that theological position, which I disagree with, um, show them a different issue in the biblical text that does not directly relate to that, and show them, looking at it in its cultural context, applying X or Y anthropological theory helps
yeah,
us understand this text better.
yeah.
Maybe don't use the term anthropological theory authored by such and such, but use terms that you're both familiar with and show a practical example. This is a way in this passage we understand it better because of critical biblical scholarship, because of anthropology, etc. And then, with that kind of seed, go back to something else and go, well, how can we look at this larger topic? Say the nature of biblical manuscripts, which really King James onlyism, a lot of it boils down to the nature of the transmission of manuscripts. Was the end result, and technically it's not the end result, but like,
I know.
was the kind of frankly arbitrary date in the 17th century, uh, 16th and 17th century, is that sort of the pinnacle of inspiration?
Yeah.
Or is it something in antiquity that has been transmitted? Is it a historical witness that has been transmitted throughout
So
the ages?
I think it's a good time to probably bring it up. Did you prepare some verses we could look at that deal with um, kind of having that cultural anthropological background to understand? Did you get time to
Sure.
get? Okay.
Yeah, I have some
I
more
can
of
just.
a concept from the Bible,
Okay.
but I think it's an effective example of how anthropology can be applied. I won't bring up any specific verses, but I'll reference some. In the priestly material in the Bible, which is it's a scholarly proposal of a source document for the Torah. It mostly centers around Leviticus. Those two terms are synonymous in many instances, but
Yeah.
the priestly stuff is a little bit bigger. It also refers to a genre, a style of writing.
Yeah.
So in the priestly material, there's a lot of discussion of sacrifices. And
Sacrifices or
yeah,
korban,
yeah,
offering. You know.
yeah, offering.
Right. Not.
Those ritual uh, activities, and it's part of the cult. Scholars call it the cult. Now, cult doesn't mean like cult leader, kind of like the stereotype from pop culture. Cult is a system of ritual to worship a
Yeah.
deity. So all religions have a cultic
Yeah.
apparatus.
It often refers to a ritual complex, right? Like we see with the
Yes, yep,
Mishkan, the tabernacle, to use
yep.
that word. whatever.
Certainly, yeah.
But
Um, yeah, and in the cultic apparatus, there was offerings and sacrifices, and those would produce waste. Not all the animal would be sacrificed. The hooves and the hair and um, fecal matter would not be offered, which is frankly logical. You're not going to put entrails filled with feces on God's altar.
yeah, pretty
And that would
reasonable
be,
to get rid of those.
yeah, yeah, makes sense. And that would be discarded. We see this referenced in Leviticus 4, chapter 4, chapter 8, and chapter 16. Now, the cultural logics of that can really be explained by anthropology, but I'd like to look at the development of this concept of uh, sacrificial waste briefly, because in the rabbinic period, in later texts, Mishnaic and Talmudic. I'll try and find I'll pull up the exact references for that. But in later texts, um, the temple waste is viewed as its own sacrifice. Like it gets upgraded from just like this thing that anyone can do in in like any pure place outside of the camp. It gets upgraded from that to having its own ritual complex. Uh, I just need to find the Talmudic passages. So some of the passages are um, Sifra 6 and 12, um, M Zeva 1, verse 1, uh, B Zeva 104b, etc. So these different rabbinic texts, all the way through the Middle Ages, conceive of this thing that in the priestly literature is just a necessary byproduct of the sacrificial system, and it gets upgraded to being it must be done by a priest, which that's also kind of practical, having a Levite be required to do it,
That,
because they
that's
do
that's
those.
a popular topic right now, dealing with the red heifers. Some of the tasks that
Sure.
in the Tanakh didn't necessarily have to be done by priests.
Yes, yeah.
You'll see the occasional red heifer commentator. This
Hmm.
really has to be done by a Cohen. It's a grave sin if not otherwise. Da 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 da. So you see that in that vein too, right?
Yeah, yeah, kind of the same thing. Um, and anthropology can come along, and there's other texts that have different conceptions of this as well. The Epistle of Hebrews refers to those Leviticus passages in a very interesting way, and
Yes. Yes,
other
indeed.
texts do as well.
Right.
Ezekiel kind of refers to that. Ezekiel is a very similar conception.
Yeah.
Ezekiel is a
And
priestly author.
I'll throw it out there real quick. People who are watching this that are more New Testament focused, Carl's very focused on the Hebrew Bible. I really
Mhm.
enjoy the Hebrew Bible. Of course, I love the New Testament as well. But if we can better understand texts like Leviticus, the Torah, um,
Mhm.
and the histories of the Bible, for Leviticus, for example, we can better understand Hebrews,
Mhm.
right?
Yep.
So that's kind of, if you're kind of lost in this, we really have to understand the basis of the text that we're working with and the way they thought about them, right? Like we've been
Mhm.
talking about this whole time. But anyway, carry on, Carl.
Yeah, certainly. So, and I can talk a little bit about New Testament as well, but there's a real question here that scholars have raised. Why is there a trajectory? Why is there a development from the priestly material to later material? Naphtali S. Meshel pointed this out, that there is an evolution. And I think that we can seek to answer that question with anthropological method. She's a cultural anthropologist. She was in a few other similar fields as well. But Svetlana Boym wrote a very interesting article. I got assigned in a Jewish studies class down here, but it's called Nostalgia and Its Discontents back in 2007. And she argued there are two types of nostalgia. Nostalgia literally has a Greek etymology. It means
Hmm.
longing for home, or that desire to return home. Um, she described two types of nostalgia. So she described restorative nostalgia that literally seeks to return to a past state, that they must return to that previous conception. Um, and the other one, oh, I'm blanking on the name of the other one right now. So, and the other type that Boehm talks about is reflective nostalgia. And that is a nostalgia that doesn't seek to return to a past state. It it cannot return to a past state. Like it's a more of a memory. And I would argue that the increase of the sacrality of the temple waste is a result of that restorative nostalgia. And she pointed out that restorative nostalgia doesn't only seek to restore to this like carbon copy of a previous state, but it seeks to sort of increase. It seeks to restore to an idealized version of the past. So it kind of ramps up a little bit. So I would propose that the rabbinic authorities who had underwent the destruction of the temple, who had been exiled from the land, were practicing that restorative nostalgia, seeking through their texts to have a literary restoration of their people, a restoration to a previous way of doing things, whether that way happened or not, that was sacred and pure, where everything was done by the priests, everything was done in a pure manner, everything followed all of these different regulations. And I'm not saying that there's no value in the Mishnaic or Talmudic material, certainly not. Like there's a lot of value in its oral witness.
No,
But just
ton.
this specific example, and this may have been something that happened in the Second Temple period. It's just that there was an increase from the biblical text to sort of the later rabbinic authorities. And I think by looking at other cultures that sought similar restoration in through literary means, through ritual means, etc., we can better understand the motivations that rabbinic authorities would have for emphasizing some of these rituals. Um, that we can understand that trajectory better.
Yeah, so that's one very great example of how um the cultural anthropological view
Mm,
can, impact how we read the Bible. And that's kind of a it wouldn't be complex for you, but that's kind of more complex for the average person.
mm,
I recommend people get this. It's not going to show, is it? It's not going to show. But the cultural background study Bible that you recommended me, um,
mm,
just to get very, very nice, detailed
sure.
commentary on a lot of different passages throughout the whole Bible. Very good work, very detailed. I would highly recommend it. I know John Walton worked on it. I don't know who else off the top of my head, but
Greg Keener.
Greg Keener, okay. I'm sure New Testament, right?
Yeah.
Um, and there's some other ones, but that one in particular, it's cheap, it's very good. Comes in NIV and KJV. The NRSV is like almost impossible to get, but
Yeah.
definitely recommend you pick that up. I think the NIV is only like um $25 or something, so it's it's a steal for sure. And that'll give you that's just one verse in Leviticus that we looked at, right? Or one
Yeah.
section of verses or passages, one
Hmm.
example. This will give you tons of stuff,
Yeah.
right? And you'll just be amazed when I read all the commentary on Genesis, and there is so much stuff that you wouldn't understand
Yeah.
just reading it without the background, right?
Oh,
So,
certainly. Yeah.
very important. Carl recommended me that I think I already said, but he's recommended me a lot of good books. Get
Thank
one
you.
for yourself. Anyone who's watching this, very cheap, amazing content and commentary. I'd highly recommend. And
Yeah,
we'll
definitely.
look at more resources at the end here, but we'll keep on moving along. Next question is how is this relevant for biblical studies? We've already discussed a lot of that.
Hmm.
So if you just want to make a quick comment on that, and we can move on to the next portion too, because we've
Sure.
touched on a lot of that already. Like it's very relevant to biblical
Yeah. Oh,
studies.
definitely. Anthropology provides a set of methodologies, a set of frameworks for approaching the Bible in both technical and culturally sensitive ways, ways that are sensitive to the diversity of culture, to varying expressions of culture. Um, it allows us a set of frameworks to have real close looking of the text. And then once we undergo that thick description of a biblical passage, we can go on to look at specific methodologies. And a lot of more critical scholars who have looked at anthropology in the Bible often do like what I just proposed there. They take an anthropological theory, there's a challenge that our thick description of the Bible raises a question, and we use that sort of cross-cultural comparison, that theory, that methodology, and we apply it to the biblical text. Um, Now, that's kind of the more upper level academic thing. You know, the basics. Being an anthropologist doesn't mean like digesting a mountain of theory. It
Right,
means being reflexive, practicing thick description, and trying to practice this cultural comparison, recognizing, you know what, our perspectives aren't everything.
right,
There's more to it. And then applying that framework to the cultures of the biblical text, to its cultural context. Now, anthropology is a specific tool that critical biblical scholars use. It's one tool in the toolbox, so to speak. But I think it's a very valuable one. Also, it provides a control because of that reflexivity and that cross-cultural comparison. Sometimes even critical scholars can make theories that are a little wild. Um, and I find that anthropology often is a useful control or test on some of those more wild
right.
theories.
And it's amazing how that does pan out too. Like, um, how the Bible is, you
Yeah.
know, very accurate as a historical document, and you can even apply anthropology to it based on
Yeah.
the ancient cultures. Like, the average atheist or um, secular person doesn't think of the Bible as an historical document. But I mean, there's so many things that disprove that. Anthropology,
Yeah.
what cultures we use um, to view the biblical text through anthropology,
Yeah.
language, culture, history, I mean, archaeology.
Yeah.
It goes on and on.
Yeah. Yeah. And biblical minimalists oftentimes try and reject the value of the Bible for being a witness to the past, but fundamentalists kind of do in their own way. While they think it's history, if they hold a um, hyper strict version of inspiration or like divine dictation of the Bible, then once again, like we're not viewing it as I believe the Bible is inspired. That's theological faith claim that I hold to,
Right.
but um, we also need to view it as a living text, a text that has a cultural context. And when we view it like that, it just comes alive. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, instead of the Bible demands for us, those of us who uh, uphold it in our various traditions, it demands for us to understand it, to wrestle with it, to try and understand it better. Um, and that anthropological framework is it's one way to do that, but I find it to be a very interesting and very methodologically sound method
Right.
approach.
Right. And my point in bringing that up was like you do have, these liberal scholars would bring up a point that can be kind of crazy, but we have the actual source documents, the reliability of the biblical text, we have anthropology to flesh it out because it
Hmm.
validates the truth of the Bible and the setting of which it was in, to flesh out these more liberal arguments. And it
Yeah,
seems to me to be pretty consistent that that's the way it goes because the Bible is truth.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. It challenges our assumptions.
yeah.
Anthropology challenges our assumptions about it.
I love
Um,
it. I don't know about you, I
yeah.
love it.
Oh, I do as well. Yeah.
It's
Sure.
humbling. Like
Yeah.
when you're raised thinking a certain way, like everything has to be a certain way. That's just how it
Mhm.
is, like you said at the beginning. And you're like, oh, that's not how it is. It's like, okay, I don't really understand anything now.
Well, that's the foundation for learning more.
Oh yeah. Recognizing that there's a lot you don't know, right?
Hmm.
So we can go into the last section and then maybe give some recommendations to where
Sure.
people can learn more because I think we are running pretty tight on time here. Uh, the last subject that we're going to address is how do similarities and differences play out in all these things between different cultures in the Bible? How does it all play out?
Mhm.
I know we see some of that in the biblical text. How does it play out and how does it flesh out? What are we looking at here, Carl?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, the ancient Israel was on the crossroads of many different trade networks. We touched on some of that, but they interacted with all the cultures around them on a regular basis. Um, they had different thoughts, ideas, concepts, worldviews.
Yeah.
The Egyptian mythologies have their own worldview. The Akkadian mythologies have their own worldview.
And may I point
And
out real quick, that's exactly what you would expect to see with the amazing revelation to the Jewish people, to Israel, of monotheism and the true God, the God of life, in contrast to the Egyptian God of death. That's exactly what you do see, right? Which
yeah,
is amazing. It's amazing.
there are many differences, but there are also overlaps. There's
Oh yeah.
also areas of cultural similarity. Uh, many of them were farmers. They farmed different things. The ways Egyptians did agriculture were different than the Akkadians, were different than the Israelites tending sheep in the hill
Yeah.
country. Um,
And for the viewer, don't think that that's unimportant either. We have the calendar to deal with,
yes.
um, offerings. Like agriculture is also a big part of the Bible.
Yeah.
Talks a lot about animals, you
It
know.
the amount yeah, the amount of metaphors based on agriculture.
Yeah.
Even just, Psalm 104 describes uh how how powerful God is by describing the rain. Like
Yeah.
that's the way. But then an Egyptian text, it's
Something we
often
don't
compared to
understand.
Psalm 104, the great hymn to the Aten, which is an older text than Psalm 104, but the great hymn to the Aten talks about the river. And just like that sort of fundamental thing, like Egyptian culture revolved around the river, Israelite culture in the highlands was more rain-based. And just like something like even basic like that, we don't notice it, but then like the metaphors in scripture make so much more sense. When you
Yeah.
think about, oh, this is their lived reality. We make metaphors about our work and all that we do, what? I'm in a pickle. Like that's a metaphor
Right.
based on
An
American
idiom
culture.
too. Like there's idioms in the Bible that
Yeah,
we don't
exactly.
understand. There's a lot of
Idioms.
idioms we don't understand in the Bible.
Yeah. Yeah. And when we can put these different cultures in dialogue, the stories make so much more sense. When we look at the Mesopotamian flood accounts and their theology, their understanding of the divine, of the gods as sort of fickle, who want to just punish humanity because they're noisy, that's what the Mesopotamian accounts actually say.
Yeah.
And then we look at the biblical accounts like, no, God is a God of love and mercy, and the earth had become corrupt. It's not because people were noisy, it's
Yeah.
because the like chaos was reigning.
Right.
And all different, I just briefly mentioned two sort of examples there off the top of my head, but all throughout the Bible we see that. We see these cross-cultural comparisons. And when we can take these cross-cultural comparisons and apply anthropological methods to them, it really becomes clear. It shines. It helps us understand the Bible so much better in such a deeper way.
Yeah, and the little that I've studied feels like a lot to me, but the little that I've studied, like with the priestly text, it's like that is
Hmm.
so true, man.
Yes.
You're missing a lot.
Oh,
I'd
yeah.
encourage everyone to get into anthropology. But were you finished up there?
Hmm.
Okay.
Yep, that's my brief pitch for look at cognate cultures.
Yes,
Look at
cognate cultures, cognate languages. Look
yep,
at the
yep.
cognate. That's the reoccurring theme.
Yes, yeah, look at the neighbors, the similar languages and cultures
Right.
and where the differences are often so important. And taking a close look at that just helps make the message of the Bible shine out
Yeah.
so much more brightly.
And it's crazy. It is crazy how more you understand it, how much more, sorry, how much more you understand it. And it's
Mm,
beautiful, like understanding, poetry, narrative, learning Hebrew, like I'm currently in the process of. It's like,
hmm
wow, it really shows how divine the text is. I mean, it really does. Um, all the things combined is really beautiful, and it puts together one amazing story of
hmm
God and his people. So with that, we're kind of at the end here. Do you have any recommendations that people can go to learn more about anthropology? Sorry, man,
Yeah.
fumbling. But any books, articles, particular authors or scholars you'd suggest? I brought up the Cultural Background Study Bible.
hmm
Definitely recommend that, like I said earlier. And
Yeah,
there's a lot of priestly stuff that I'll wait for until the second part.
sure.
So,
Yeah, first just I'll do a few theorists of just general anthropology that I find very helpful that have been taught in my education here. One is Victor W. Turner. He was a religious studies scholar back in the 60s. I didn't get a chance to talk about him tonight, but he has fascinating theories about how rituals can build what he terms communitas, or these communal bonds, how it can break down the uh, oppressive structures in society and build up greater unity. So, Victor Turner. I also referenced Geertz, Clifford Geertz. Uh, I referenced from his work the interpretation of cultures, but basically all of his stuff would be very helpful. And those are just a few theorists that you can kind of dip your toes into anthropology, and then a few uh, scholars I've engaged with in terms of biblical anthropology include, um, let's see, yeah, they include Carl Allen Kuhn, who wrote Purity, Things in Their Proper Place. And that's about anthropological methodologies for the New Testament. how they help frame the debates between early Christians and between the Pharisees and the various different Jewish sects of the time. Um, and another book that I've engaged with is Anthropology and Biblical Studies: Avenues of Approach, edited by Luis J. Lawrence and Mario I. Aguilar. Brill published it back in
Yeah.
2004. And that's a book that looks at some of these methodologies. And a an additional plug, if I may, for more general critical biblical scholarship. Myself and another friend from the Church of God, Anson Dowd, have just started up a podcast. It's called Critical Faith with Carl and Anson. Um,
Yeah.
and
We can leave a link to that in the description for the viewers.
Thank you. Yeah,
Uh,
that'd be wonderful. There, we don't only talk about anthropology, but there we talk about critical biblical scholarship and we seek to apply it. We seek to apply it to the faith lives of modern day believers. The goal is to bring these conversations to have spiritual fruit in Sabbatarian communities and anyone who would be interested as well.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll leave a link in the description of that. And you guys just did your first episode. Have you recorded your second one yet? Is that coming soon?
Yes, we
All right.
have recorded several and we're planning on uploading
Oh,
about one
good.
a month.
Great. That's good to hear. Um, all right. I think uh, we've given enough, and our time is up. So we'll have part two coming once again. Uh, the priestly sources, ritual. Uh, we're going to talk a lot about Jacob Milgram, I'm sure. So stay tuned for that. And thank you guys for watching.
Yep, thank you very much.